Okay, I'm back, and in this video we're going to set up the throttle servo in the radio and make sure that the push rod is where it needs to be at, in relationship to the throat of the carburetor. So you're going to see three things going on here. One is the scene you see now, which is the throttle servo. The other scene will be the throat of the carburetor, and then the third thing will be the radio itself. So I'll be back in a second, and after I get the setup finished. Okay, this is the next thing you're looking at, which is the throat of the carburetor, and I'll move the throttle arm by hand and note that the push rod is still free, and I'm going to push it so that there's no not even a little tiny crack right here. I want to make sure that the throat of the carburetor is closed, and I'll stop there and show you the radio. Okay, I'm going to turn the radio on and let it warm up. And the first thing I want you to note is the throttle trim down here is all the way back to -100, and that the throttle itself is all the way back. And then I'm going to turn on the airplane after I move the camera. Hold on. Okay. So I'm going to turn the receiver on. The little switch is right here. I'm going to turn the receiver on. The receiver is plugged in, and the throttle servo wire is plugged into the receiver. So I'm going to turn it on. Oops. Okay. And notice, as usual, the servo always goes to the center first, where it picks up where the stick is. So the servo centered went all the way to the back, and you can see I can move the stick, and it moves. And notice that the push rod's not moving forward or backward because the little bolt right here is not screwed down. So what do we need to do? Okay, so the radio is set where I want it. And the push rod is all the way back. Okay, so you can see me moving the push rod forward and then moving the push rod back. Okay, so push rod is all the way back, the throttle is all the way down, the trim is all the way back to a -100. I'm going to take my 3/32 and tighten this up. And I usually like to, I'll try to show it to you from this side, okay? So I usually like to hold a finger on the push rod as I do the tightening. Okay. Okay, you can hear that servo buzzing as I was tightening it down with the Allen wrench there. So now with that tightened, I want to see, first off I want to make sure that nothing touches the side over here, and it doesn't. Okay, so nothing is touching the side, that's good. And now we got to go back and look at the throat of the carburetor and see if it's traveling at 100%. Now, what we're going to do is several adjustments, potentially. May not do any of them, we'll see. First off, you can adjust this arm in and out. Now, I just put this arm where it was so that the quick connect wouldn't touch. And I also, if you recall, cut this off with the assumption that that wouldn't touch, and so both of those assumptions were good. So now I'm going to stop the camera and go back to the throat of the carburetor. Okay, so there's the throat of the carburetor. The throttle stick is all the way back, and as I push it forward, it goes up to 100%. And when you bring it all the way back down, it closes, 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 and very, very tiny, and then disappears, which is exactly what I want. So now the next thing is we got to set the idle trim. So the throttle trim button on the radio, I'll show you in a minute, but I'm going to push that button forward until it goes. Remember, I showed you at the beginning that the trim was minus 100. I'm going to move it all the way up to 0. Oops, went too far. There's 0. Okay, let me see if I can get a little closer here. No. Okay, that's about as close as this camera's going to get. Let me see if I can get a little. No, it just won't focus there. There it is. Okay, so without touching the carburetor, I'm going to use a pointer here. So you can see right down in there that there's a tiny little crack. It's less than 1/8 of an inch probably, and that's with the trim set at 0. If I move the trim all the way up to plus 100%, it's up quite a bit. Okay, so that's your trim range from minus 100 to plus 100% of the throttle trim. That is certainly enough space for that to work. So I'm going to move it back to 0 and see how that. Okay, you can hear the sound of the beeps to let you know you're at the 0. So listen again. That's 0. Okay, we don't need the timer on. Actually, I think that's a pretty good starting point for the trim. I usually like to have the trim after the engine's broken in to be about 0. So I'm going to. This is actually pretty good. Remember, we also did one other thing. So I'm going to stop the camera here and focus in on the radio. Be right back. Okay, so here's the radio. You see that the trim value for the throttle right here is 0. And I'm going to go into the servo setup by pressing the button over here once. Go into servo setup, and I note that the travel is at 60/60. That's where we said was the initial, when we first, one of the first setups I did was travel of the throttle being minus 60 to plus 60. Remember, the throttle's reversed, so it's going in the opposite direction here. So that's throttle all the way closed. And so what we can do is we can adjust the value, either 60 on the high side or 60 on the low side if we need to. But the throttle trim looks good, and so I'm going to declare I was lucky this time and don't need to change anything. I'm going to leave the 60/60. I'm going to leave the throttle trim at 0. And I'll probably, when I first start the engine, have that throttle trim up a little higher, maybe even 30 or plus 30 clicks. And actually it's plus 15 clicks because each click is 2 values. That's adjustable, by the way. That's another story. So I'm going to leave it right where it is, and not until I start the engine and figure out where that trim needs to be, and not till after at least 5 or 6 hours of flying with it will the engine break in and be settled down, and then you can set the trim finally. So we've got a pretty standard setup, and so I'm going to leave it at that. That's where the trim is going to sit. And so the trim's going to sit in 0. I certainly have if I can move that trim all the way forward, and that's going to be more than enough room. The other thing I want to say is,
6 minutes.
All right, we don't need the timer. The other thing I was going to say was that when you initially start the engine, you want to run it rich, get it broke in, have lots of oil in there when you break in. And so the first maiden flight is going to run with a rich, with the throttle trim up quite a bit, having it one, so it doesn't die on me, but two, just to make sure there's plenty of oil going through with the maiden flight to make it run well. So that's the setup of the throttle trim and the throttle servo. Thank you very much.